Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We talked in jury selection about how it's taken us twice, and so before I get into my pre-prepared statement, I just want to address a couple of things. First is the possible hasn't been eliminated. I know they use that for both their opening and their closing, but it is not impossible for a person to commit suicide. Our common life experience will probably show us that suicide can be surprising, or to make a rash and bold decision. Additionally, testing and science is the way to eliminate possibilities. And so the impossible hasn't been eliminated, but also the bruising has been misleading in this case. And so when you take the exhibits, you'll get all the exhibits back. And I'm purposely not going to go through photos in closing. We'll talk about some aspects and some things that you should look for. But you got to look at one of the timestamps of when those pictures were taken. There's a drastic difference. For instance, in the Deputy Wheeler's photographs that were taken before midnight, the ball was in the tub, and pictures where there's drastic water depth and the line is here. You see the water's clear as they're draining. They're taking photos when they're draining. So they're grouped together. You have 16A through, whatever. They're all grouped together. But pay attention to the photos and where that blood line is. As the tub drains, in Northrop's photos in particular, you'll see the blood line. But the bruising is misleading for many ways. And the main thing is, for instance, Ms. Acevedo, her photos are post-autopsy. And again, I don't want to even demonstrate it, but you've seen the pictures. You're basically removing the scalp. You're flipping over the body. You're doing a neck dissection. That's a long period of time. Both Dr. Spock, the first time he testified, and Dr. Howard talked about lividity and where's that blood going when there's no circulation. It's going to raise into some discoloration that looks like bruising and is lividity. So it's careful that you need to do it. But the issue comes down to blood. And the reason why is because there's no petechiae, there's no damage to the hyoid bone. And Dr. Smock's explanation is that if you do this restraint a particular way, you can cut off 100% of circulation, and that's why you get some petechiae. Obviously, if we stop petechiae, that changes the whole case. So the case does come down to the volume of blood on this. So first, obviously, in all of our experiences, we have tragedy. We respond to tragedy in different ways. There's different people that will respond very emotionally. Other people are more stoic. But we have all experienced tragedy. And I want to be clear that just because we're a defense here, this is a tragedy. No matter how this pans out. Whether she committed suicide or not, that's for you to decide. But it's tragic either way when we're dealing with a case like this. But the point of talking about that is when you were selected as jurors, you're making a commitment to set aside the emotions. These are very emotional. We hear stories from family. We hear stories of situations. Very, very understandable to feel the loss of Kendy. But you as jurors have the toughest job to be able to separate those emotions. Talking about emotions is people respond differently. We've heard Dan described as stoic and reserved. We've heard him, we saw his son, Wyatt, on the stand, who comes across maybe stoic and reserved, not painting testimony, but basically being open when asked by counsel, would you change your opinion if you saw X, Y, and Z? And he says, yeah. compare that to his sister, who very clearly early on, first phone call or when she calls back, very emotional. People respond differently. And so it's important that you take the emotions into consideration, but focus on this case objectively based upon the facts that you have in front of you. There very clearly was a family dispute, and that's evident, and in some ways that may have shaped this case. But we talked about the different personalities. So I want to walk through some of this. So the 7/10 incident in 2020. You have video that shows officers responding and there's no abuse. You also have the 911 call. It's up to you to determine the credibility of the witnesses and what your observations are. But her state of mind when she makes that call. But she very clearly tells the officer there was no physical abuse. The only comments are to Michelle and to Mr. Prado. Now, what's significant about there is throughout this, we have to examine her credibility in the sense of contextually what was going on. She told Mr. Prado that Dan made her delete all the photos. Well, clearly that didn't happen because the photos were there almost a year later when his phone was seized at the scene. Or when her phone was seized at the scene. The photos were there, you have all the photos and evidence. So she's clearly not being honest with her conversations with Mr. Prado. There are witnesses, Carrie and Brett, and you can examine their credibility. You know, the state wants to say, well, they could have gone to law enforcement at any time. But why would they? We're talking about someone falling against a boat. You wouldn't expect to go to law enforcement with that. You only go to law enforcement if you expected something illegal happening. So why would they go? It wasn't made aware to them until 2023 was the testimony of Detective Law&Crime. And 27, 28 years, not a single person has said that even that Dan raised his voice in anger. We have reference from Brooke that there's some name calling as far as weight and stuff, but no witnesses to any abuse in almost 30 years. No witness to any physical abuse of that sort. So it makes you wonder. Why do we have this charge? A bruise on your chest that was not investigated. The date of that is 10 months prior. There's no witnesses, and there's really no admission from Kendy that Dan affirmatively did it. So why did they charge him? That's maybe relevant, maybe not, but maybe it's to bolster the case. So your instructions, and you can do it how you want, but I would advise you to read the instructions, particularly the ones that we went over 2 weeks ago. You each get them. This is kind of like your Bible. So when we walk in here, there's not going to be a lot of dispute. We're not, the July 20th, the date of Idaho. But the issue is whether he actually there's a delay or something. Okay, there it goes. The one thing I would say about the date is the date is not about the bruising, lividity, contusions, discoloration from her death, autopsy, etc. The bruising is as it relates to the incident in July 10th. Now, you'll have the photos, you have photos of the trailer, you have the testimony, and you'll be able to look at the bruises. And you can see there's a big bruise that kind of trails off to the center, consistent with a trolling motor. So you can examine that. But I don't want to spend much time on the 710 because I want to get into the main issue. I think it's key to keep in mind that Kendy was living a secret life. And there's no judge, there's not illegal, there's nothing illegal about that. But she was living a secret life. So she wasn't being honest with Michelle, with her parents, with her husband. She wasn't, and even in some cases with Mr. Prado. But you have an incident where Dan had come home. You have their messages. You could read through them. There was a delay by 2 days, or suspicion, or you had an affair. You see more of that conversation on the first, where Kendy is accusing Dan of having an affair. Who did you go see? What help? I called the hotel. Where you at? But Dan comes home. There's no black clothes in evidence. When you watch the video, it's a little bit smudged, but when you watch the video, you can see that it's the same clothes that were in the washer. Mr. Prado had a 15-second phone call with her, and they didn't call back. They called her parents and didn't call back. Didn't do anything about it. So, there's no dark clothes found anywhere in the house. There's no gloves in evidence. There's no anything. So she comes home the next day. And here's again, some of what we need to take the emotion off and focus on the science is there's a balance in a 28-year relationship of, yeah, I want you back. Hey, I love you more than anything. Please come home. To being controlled. But she does come home, and they spend the weekend together. And here's where I think it's interesting to read some of the messages to Michelle, Tana, and her mom. She's talking about how calm they're going through their divorce, that they're splitting the assets evenly. Here's that, and they even text photos. She even texts photos to her friends. Now, so that 129 event, we don't know what was going on. It doesn't, if you were to believe that someone is standing in black clothing, that they didn't have gloves with the firearm, then yeah, it's concerning. But there was that's not what the officers found, and that's not what you have before you. That's a statement that she made to her family after she left. She packed a bag, she left, she came back on 31st. So, can she be suicidal? Well, I would posit that the family is probably not the people you should talk to. Either side, either the son or the daughter, because it is too close to home. We don't want to think that a loved one has committed suicide. But let's look at Dr. Hanger. Dr. Hanger conducted an evaluation and elicited factors, and he talked about the home's Roy life stress inventory, and he found that she had a moderate to high degree of experiencing difficulty coping. Now, he made adjustments to that, but the adjustments were made based upon early statements from the family given to law enforcement close in time to her passing. There was no direct examination of Kendy, obviously, which can increase the confidence level. And he specifically, it took me a little bit to corner him on his report, but he finally admitted in the report that it is not possible to provide an absolute predictive determination of suicidality from a records review. The point of this is, let's look at the science, let's look at the scene, let's look at the evidence. It's not let the emotions and the could she have done it or would she have, we probably all know people that we never would have expected that make rash decisions. We got to think about the science. So, here's some of the factors that I think are in favor of that. She describes herself as being in a midlife crisis more than once in the evidence that you have with text messages. To Roy Fitting, part of that is it normal to feel sick to your stomach? This is just on the 31st. Sick to your stomach about the choices you're making. On the first, she's accusing Dan of having an affair, and that's why she's late. She also, that's the same day her affair comes out. And when you read the messages between Dan and Kendy, and also Mr. Prado and Kendy, you'll see, and Kendy and her brother, you'll see this was just not a small argument. She was irate. She rapid text to her brother. She rapid text Dan. This was very, very stressful for her. That her secret life, who she thought she had kept secret, maybe her plan was to get a divorce and then slowly integrate Mr. Prado into the equation. Her plan was not to have the affair come out to her family and friends and have that be the reason why she's getting a divorce. In fact, there's messages that you have where she's told by her friends that you should not be having an affair. If you are, you shouldn't be doing that. She was blocked by her brother on that day. No one can stand here and tell you what she was thinking or what was going on in her head. What we do know is the last message she sent was to Tana.
Objection, facts not in evidence.
It is exhibit defense.
Overruled.
Her last message sent was to Tana. And that message talked about her brother blocking her. So let's look at it. Let's separate the emotions. Let's separate hypothetically what was going on. We can't know what was going on in her mind. We can feel sorry for the tragedy and miss her. But let's look at the facts and the evidence in this case of a murder or a staged suicide. So first, regarding asphyxiation. The only evidence is a lack of blood. Again, remember that Dr. Schmock compared the carotid restraint, which is taught by law enforcement, to a rear naked choke that was what you see in MMA. In fact, one of the exhibits you have from Tolleson is 3 pictures that show different holds. One of those is a rear naked choke, and Dr. Schmock talked about the rear naked choke. The reason that's necessary is because you have to have 100% circulation cut off. If blood escapes to the head, you're going to get the petechiae. All the doctors agree that there's no petechiae. So they're going by, there's not enough blood for it to be suicide. No petechiae, no damage to the highboning. So Dr. Howard was the only one to examine the body fresh. It was within 12 hours of the passing that he examined the body. And he ruled death by gunshot. He testified that there's been hundreds of intraoral gunshot wounds that he's examined, and the blood that he saw was consistent with the amount of blood that he would find. Dr. Rambrin talked about how, who's a trauma surgeon, not a medical examiner or forensic pathologist, talked about in the volume of blood that you would expect. And he used around 800 milliliters to a liter of blood. And he tried to do a demonstration. I don't think it really worked because it kind of just stuck him on the spot. But he tried to show a demonstration of what the blood would look like. Well, what they did not consider, what no one has talked about, is the amount of blood in the body bag. And why is that significant? They're saying, look at the water, it should be dark from a photo as they're draining it 8 hours later. The reason you have to consider the blood in the body bag is because there's only 2 sources of bleeding. The tongue, which we'll talk about in a bit, the tongue, and the damage caused internally to the C2 and its jaw and surrounding areas. So if you consider the blood in the body bag over there, is that enough blood consistent with suicide? If you consider the amount of blood in the body bag, plus the amount in the photos at the beginning when Wheeler first showed up, plus any amount that drained, you do have photos and evidence that show tub drainage. When they did drain, there's a line of the blood that had been going down the center to the drain. This asphyxiation, there's like too much blood. They haven't given an explanation where that blood went. And so you have to consider what's in the bag and what went down the drain. Now, location. There is no theory as to where asphyxiation occurred. Did it happen before the tub was filled up? And was it in the tub? There's no blood anywhere found in the house. You heard testimony that they checked things with luminol. There's no blood found anywhere else in the house. And you'll see it, it's in evidence, a little envelope about this big. I think there's one rock associated with it too. I don't know if it's tooth or rock, it's not glass, but there's earring backing, something, whatever it is, and then a few shards of glass that are about this big that they found 2 weeks later. There's no defensive wounds on Dan. So the one thing to keep in mind is the carotid restraint or rear naked choke is a violent maneuver. She didn't have any alcohol in her system. She didn't have any drugs except for caffeine in her system. She was not overly intoxicated. It's a violent maneuver. She just had her fingernails done. There's no damage to the fingernails. There's no defensive wounds to Dan. So if you look back at the interview, Detective Euler's body camera, he's the one that we had large chunks where we were watching at home after detectives arrived, and they're talking to Dan. And there's a point where Dan, close to 6, it's close to when he made the phone calls, but there's a point in time where Detective Loughton goes up and gets the charger. So you see his body camera, you see him go up the stairs, and you see him turn, and you see him go between the bed and the dresser. That's where that glass was. You don't see it in the video, but 2 weeks later, that's where the glass was, in that area. There's no blood or DNA on the glass. There's no sign of struggle anywhere else in the house. Nothing is found in the vacuum bag. So if that glass had come from a struggle, number one, if he's smart enough to stage a scene, wouldn't Dan pick up pieces of glass 2 weeks later? But two, there's nothing in the vacuum bag of evidentiary value, which by itself has evidentiary value. It shows that there was not an active cleanup, at least with the vacuum. Talk about the coroner photos. Again, we have this chart. I think it's 19B. This white background with the skeleton, not skeleton, but the outline of the person with diagrams of bruises. Right. A lot of those were taken on the 5th in the morgue after autopsy, after embalming. A couple of days later, what that does not mean, or they have not proven what's fluidity versus what's bruising and what's trauma from the process of the autopsy. So, the coroner photos were taken on the 5th, after the traumatic experience. You see the swollen face. That's not from injury, from abuse. That's from the autopsy, basically almost removing the face. And you have, I showed you one earlier today. You have those photos. But the face obviously is swollen by putting everything back together. They talk about they remove the internal organs. They do a Y incision, remove the internal organs, look at them, test them, put them back. Right? It's traumatic. So looking at the photos from the 5th is a little bit, it could be disingenuous. Both Dr. Howard, and we talked about this, both Dr. Howard and Dr. Smock talked about what lividity is. And Dr. Howard examined the body, no sign of injury to the neck. What I keep in mind also is in the photos, particularly Wheeler's photos, but you see her resting place in the tub. Her head is slumped down, on her chest. And again, where does blood flow? It doesn't flow. Where does it go? It settles. So what is lividity versus what is bruising? I think the photos there, you can draw your conclusions based upon the evidence. Let's look at the scene. The scene is consistent with suicide. The gun position is consistent with suicide. Now, there's testimony that Dan was a patrol officer. There's no evidence that he worked as a detective. No evidence that he had any sort of homicide training. No evidence of the knowledge of staging a scene that would fit the biomechanical information. When you look at all the possibilities, and we'll come back to this, but when you look at all the possibilities, his purpose was to rule out suicide. And out of many scenarios Dr. Desmond came up with, 2 are potentially consistent, depending on whether this is a slide by or not. That takes a lot of knowledge. She has a PhD in biomechanical engineering and is able to examine scenes. For a person not even trained to be a detective, to know exactly where to put the gun, which way to face it, that would fit the biomechanical recreation is a lot of specialty knowledge that has not been shown that Dan has. Dan's DNA is not on the gun, and it's not that he wiped it, because Kendy's DNA is on the gun, and some other male's DNA is on the gun. So that's not just wiping. That would be wiping and placing someone else's other DNA. And that's again, there's no training experience that Dan has had that. Again, scene continued. It's consistent with the slide bite on the thumb, but as you heard Dr. Desmond, even if you think that's not a slide bite, the possibilities go up. There's more scenarios that are consistent with suicide. Dan's DNA wasn't even on the bullets of the magazine. Now, let's talk about that for a second. When examining the credibility, Kendy told Mr. Prado that she was excited. She was getting her guns. She was getting her guns. So, from her own words to Mr. Prado, she was excited about having her guns. The splatter, and many people testified about the splatter to the left hand, to the right hand, to the nipple. And so, again, how do you stage that, especially without training? When you look at the photos, particularly again the earlier one, you will see on either side of the neck dark pools of blood that are going down. And when you compare that to what you observed from testing the blood and how it interacts with the water, the state has not accounted for the blood that has been expended in the scene. The blood, this is, I think, maybe 18A, but the hair, the first picture of the body, when you look at that, you'll see the hair is absolutely matted with blood, caked on the body and all that. Now let's talk about the tongue. Dr. Howard stated, point of injury, rare to have it hit the tip. Tongue is a muscle. Muscles go to relaxed state upon death. Now, You heard me ask that of a couple of witnesses. But here's the point. The injury was to the tip. If you are alive, or if you are not alive, what is the natural resting position of the tongue? Behind the front teeth. Behind the front teeth. So if she was not alive, how did the top of the tongue get injured without damage to the bottom teeth? That injury of the tongue is consistent with someone who was alive at the time of gunshot. Talk about gunshot residue. And none of the witnesses put a lot of emphasis on gunshot residue, but I think it's important to ask a couple of things. During the video of the encounter between detectives and Dan, he was asked on, I think, more than one occasion if he wanted to do GSR. He immediately says, yeah, you can do it now. Detective Northrup, I went through all the details. He's talking about how, what the weather is, what kind of house it is, the amount of detail that he put in his report. So much detail. Yet, in his report, and he admitted on stand, he did not put that Dan did this. That's never in any of the reports. They didn't take his clothing. If they thought that he did that, why wouldn't they take his clothing? But is it something that was added later to over 2 years later, now when it goes to grand jury? They didn't send Dan's kit to the lab. You have a picture of the kit that Chet talked about today. The kit that went to the lab was from the autopsy. And you have that in front of you. Let's talk about the arm. Burn, not a burn. So let's look at this. If it's a burn, again, it's not a cause of death. It's not related to the gunshot. And it's not a defensive wound. You put your hands up, right? It's onto the back of your arms. Where's the injury? It's on the inside portion of your arm. That's not a defensive wound. But it's also, there's no other evidence or moisture as far as wherever it would have occurred, that some liquid was thrown. There's no evidence of that anywhere. But could it be from making tea on a blazing hot, as was described, scorching hot basement thermos or kettle that's on the stove? Yes. But it's not related to the death. So is it a burn? That's not what the case hangs on. And even if it is a burn, there's no cause. There's no theory that Dan created that burn. There's no offer of proof that Dan created that burn. There's just, here's a burn. He must have done it. Let's use this against him in that trial. But Dr. Howard, who again was the only one who examined the body while it was fresh, described that as skin slippage. So he talked about how when you're submerged and you're under pressure, the skin slippage or the decomposition basically is rapid. Look at how she is in the tub, particularly again in Detective Wheeler's photo. Her head, her arm on the left side is up. Her body is a little bit leaning to the right, and her arm right here is up against the tub. Is that consistent with skin slippage? But either way, it doesn't. The case does not hinge on that injury. But I think it's important to point out why Dr. Howard, who's never testified for the defense in his career as the main witness, believes that it was skin slippage. Bruising versus validity. We talked about this, so I'll just. The only other thing I would tell you, Dr. Howard's opinion was death by gunshot. You have a piece of evidence in you. I believe it's Defense Exhibit C or D. I think it's C. That Acevedo, she took the photos on the 5th, February 5th. She agreed that she wouldn't sign something that she didn't agree with. She issued a death certificate. You have an evidence with her signature on it from June, saying that the cause of death was transection of the C2 with a penetrating gunshot wound to the head and neck. That was her opinion. Obviously now it might be changed, but what you have in there is the photos and the validity. Let's talk about Dr. Smock. First, he was asked in 2001, and he said he needed more information. Right? He saw the bruise or the marks, the lividity, whatever we want, contusion, whatever, blunt force trauma, whatever word we want to use, whether it's blunt force trauma like this or whatever. He saw the photos from the coroner. He saw everything back in 2021. When he issued his opinion, you heard the first time he testified, it was after Dr. Desmond issued his opinion in October of last year. Everyone else is wrong. Dr. Nara is wrong that the blood can be contained in the mouth. Dr. Nara is wrong that the lips and the broken jaw are consistent with a gunshot trauma, interoral gunshot wound. Dr. Rambert is wrong that the lips and the damage is consistent with gunshot wound. Dr. Howard's wrong that the lips and the jaw were caused by a gunshot wound. Everyone else is wrong except for Dr. Swan. The blast and the trauma of the blast, whether that's bruising or whatever that is on the scalp, that caused from hitting the head, there's force involved with the explosion of a firearm. Someone's sitting in the tub, head's going to hit back. Additionally, when it does, there's going to be some damage to the head and the mouth. Dr. Smock said that he was 100% convinced. I'm not much into science. I love science. I'm just not very good at it. But 100% doesn't seem very scientific. That seems opinionated. Compare that to Dr. Desmond. He set out to rule out suicide. Rule out suicide. This position, not suicide. This position, not suicide. He said, and what is his opinion? His opinion isn't sitting here before you, bolstering himself, saying, yeah, I have an opinion that she committed suicide. His opinion was, the evidence is consistent with suicide. It's up for you guys to decide. Dr. Smock, 100%. 100%, this is my opinion. Everyone else is wrong. You got to go with that. We already talked about how that one exhibit includes the post-autopsy photos. And Dr. Smock did not do any testing or modeling or putting together a theory of what actually could have or would have happened. We heard Dr. Desmond say testing is worth 1,000 experts, and we kind of see that in this case. And we'll come back to that. So examining Kendy's own statements, there was secret affair. She was upset about the house. She was actually excited about her gun, back and forth on what she wanted to do. Didn't have a job lined up. Here's the thing, grass is always greener. But she didn't have an exciting future lined up. The pieces weren't together. She didn't have a job. She didn't, there were issues with the house, and she didn't even know if she wanted to leave Dan or not. And we talked about it last. Her last message was not to Dan Prado. Her last message was to Tanner regarding her brother. Looking at Dan's statements, the house was added to the paperwork. You can check that for yourself. February, the heater's running. We had testimony that it was blazing hot in there. Testimony is going. How do you hear water from upstairs? If you're in the basement, how do you hear water from upstairs? You hear it through the walls, through the pipes. You hear the pipes, the water run. How do you know someone flushed the toilet upstairs? You hear it through the walls, right? So, yeah, he hears the water. But the fan's going, washer's going, or not the washer, the dryer's going, and he hears something like a thud. Yeah. Little things matter. If Dan has set a scene, why would he say that he heard a thud? Why would he say, I heard a gunshot, went upstairs, called 911? Right? He's a former law enforcement officer, former firearms instructor. If he was setting a scene, why would he say it was a thud? He was cooperative with law enforcement for hours. And we heard, I think during opening, we heard that you would hear testimony that he was asking people for coffee or whatever. You watched, 4 or 5 hours of video. Not once did he do that. Most of the time, he sat in the same position. And again, people respond to emotional trauma differently. How he responds might be different from how another person responds, which would be different too than how another person responds. But what did he do? He cooperated with law enforcement. He made mention of a prior incident where Kendy had expressed suicide ideation. Put a gun to her head in the bedroom, in the closet, pulled it down, and when she pulled it down, she discharged. The officers went to confirm her. They found a hole right where they said it was. Why? Well, again, it was objective, not emotional. Said, yeah, when I was in middle school, a bullet came down. Right? We didn't get into hearsay. That's what he observed. A bullet coming down through that closet floor. We'll talk about the 40 caliber. There's photos and evidence. You go through there. You'll see Fallon. You'll see the breach. Also, what you'll see if you examine, you also have the physical 40 itself. You'll notice that the sight is all the way to the right. It's not in the middle. And so Dan is talking about how he changed the sight. He moved that sight all the way to the right. And you'll be able to examine that. So examining the totality of the scene. Blood sinks to the bottom when agitated. Dr. Desmond didn't force the scenarios. There's no way to quantify how much blood was drained. And suicide is consistent with the evidence. We see the blood line around the body. Again, when you examine, you might find that there appears to be more than 800 millimeters that Dr. Ambrose said he would expect to find in an injury. The scene, the blood, the body bag, drain, the tub, supports that there was a lot of blood. And again, the state doesn't have any evidence of how the scene was staged. And I apologize. I see what you're saying. There is a delay in this. No theory. Was she placed in the tub, then water filled up, then shot? Why isn't there more water around? The only part of water was there was a damp, the bathhouse. It's not on the floors, nothing. If the water was in there, then Dan certainly would have blood on them. And again, it doesn't explain there were no gloves found, so he would have had to use his hand and scrub it and put someone else's DNA on it. So the state hasn't offered one theory on what happened. Where the asphyxiation took place, when she was shot, why there's no blood anywhere else in the house, and no evidence on Dan, no scratch marks, no. A person who's not intoxicated, not drugged, is not going to let someone just sit, is not going to sit there and not attack, especially with fresh guns. So we looked at, I just have a couple more slides left. We looked at the Dr. Desmond's chart, and the point of this chart is they considered more than 10, but they ruled something out quickly. If it was a left-handed fire, it would have been to the left side. So rule out those. And you go through here. There's 2 that are consistent. If we remove the slide light, there's 2 that are consistent all the way across the board. With the slide light, if that is a slide light, then there's one scenario that's significant. The point of me telling you that, or pointing that out, is how technical, the technical expertise it would take to stage this scene. It's not just choking her out, shooting her, dropping the gun in the tub, washing her hands, being done. You actually have to place the gun a certain way. You actually have to get everything just right. And you have a lot. I'll continue without that. So we saw on here the blood accumulation in the water, and you remember the test that. Okay, we have it. Remember the test that we had. That the blood accumulated in the water. The blood testing in the water. When we saw that, how the water or the blood sank to the bottom. Sank to the bottom. It didn't just make it. It's not a toilet where you have a bunch of movement and agitated water as you're turning it. The water shows that it was draining. The blood pulled to the bottom and went from there. So when we get to this, I'm just going to fast forward this portion. When we get to this portion, you all remember the testing. That was only testing that was done, and it's so significant because this case is about the blood. The testing of the blood and the line that it moves, and what the hair does. If she, as the water drains, the hair is not going to be as noticeable or visible in later photos. And how the blood was traveling, you see that. When it's all said and done, there is no theory where it doesn't fit the science, it doesn't fit the scene, it does not fit the facts. When you separate out the emotions and look at the evidence, the state has not been burdened. And that burden is a high burden. Many of us have friends and family or ourselves that have served in the military, protecting our Constitution, being presumed innocent on every count until that presumption is overcome beyond a reasonable doubt is one of the fundamental principles of what we fight for the Constitution that we have. And that burden, when applied to this case, is significant. You don't have to put your stamp of approval on Dan. You don't have to like him as a father. You don't have to like him as a husband. People, he's not on trial for that. He's on trial for domestic battery from a bruise and for first-degree murder for a staged suicide. That doesn't fit the evidence. Even if you believe it's more likely than not, then you have an obligation to find him not guilty because that's not the standard. The standard is reasonable doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, when you apply that to this case, we ask that you find Mr. Howard